Chapter 5 Broken Foot Camp. On our next trip round the huts, about 2 weeks later, we'd left the right branch of the Menua Creek one day heading for the Mengawero Forks, and on a narrow track down a ridge we ran into 2 men and 2 women coming the other way. Even the dogs were taken by surprise. The only thing to do was stop and talk. We couldn't walk through them. It was the first other people I'd been this close to since Auntie Bella's funeral. My heart was thumping. "Hello there," someone said. "Good day," said Uncle Heck. "Where are you lot heading?" "We're on our way out to the road from—" "Hey, you're not the ones they're looking for, are you?" "What do you mean, looking for?" said Uncle Heck. "Everyone's been asked to keep a lookout for a middle-aged man and a young Maori boy. They've been missing in the bush for over 3 months." "No kidding," said Uncle Heck. "Sure haven't you heard about it?" "Couldn't be us, mate. We've only come in here for the weekend hunting." One of the women caught me sneaking a look at the watch to see what day of the week it was. "Thursday." "Well, if you do see anyone like that, tell them they're supposed to report to the nearest police station urgently." "Okay, we'll do that," said Uncle Heck, moving past them. "Have a nice walk." "Thanks, the same to you." And we were away from them along the track. We didn't stop or say anything until we'd reached the creek at the bottom of the ridge. "Do you think they knew it was us?" I asked after we'd dropped our packs and had the billy hanging in the fire. "For sure," said Uncle Heck. "They'd have to be pretty dumb not to. They'll go straight out and tell the police they saw us. What would the police want us for?" "It's me they want." "Why?" "Taking you off into the bush, I suppose. But there's no law against that, is there?" "If there's not, they'll probably make one," he said. "They're doing some pretty strange things out there these days." "Why can't they just leave us alone?" I said. "It's not fair." "If you're looking for a fair deal, forget it," said Uncle Heck. "You'd only ever run into one of those by accident, knowing that those trampers would probably report seeing us." And where we climbed onto the main ridge and dropped over into the Pucareo stream and stayed the night in the Pucareo hut. And the next day, on our way to Nagahirimai, we walked straight into 2 men with rifles in the Wakatane River. We walked right up to them and past them. "Good day," said one of them. "Good day," said Uncle Heck, without stopping. And when we were 20 or so yards past them, one of them called out, "Hey!" We stopped and looked back. "You 2 are supposed to report to the nearest police station urgently." "Yes," said Uncle Heck, "we already got the message." And we walked on away from them. "We'd better get out of this area," said Uncle Heck. "It's crawling with other people around here." So we climbed another long ridge over the Te Maua Range and down the other side to a big creek, where we caught a skinny pig and camped on a sandy river beach. From there we crossed the Kairaka Range and picked up a stash of food we had hidden near the Tepawa hut. Another day's walking brought us to a jumble of short, steep ridges and waterfally creeks. There was plenty of deer and pig sign around, and we caught a good pig and camped where the creek we were following opened out into a fairly wide area of shingle and bush flats. It was the hardest, longest walk we'd done for a long time. "We might get left alone here for a bit," said Uncle Heck, "but we'll still have to keep out of sight of the choppers. I wouldn't be surprised if they've been told to keep a watch out for us." "Where are we anyway?" I said. "Right in the guts of it," he said, and it was easy to believe him. The bush here was steeper and more primitive looking than over in the Watercress Valley. The creeks were narrower and steeper, and the pigs skinnier and nastier. They chased the dogs. Harder sort of country, even the same ferns seemed coarser and scratchier here. As far as I could figure out from the torn scrap of map I had of the area, we were in a side creek in the headwaters of the Watercress River, right as Uncle Heck said, in the guts of it. Strange territory, lost among more strange territory. When it rained the day after we got there, even the downpour seemed wetter than usual. But we soon had a worse problem than just getting wet. When we were setting up our camp, a certain uncle pulled a big rock out of the bank to shield one side of the fireplace, and it fell onto his boot against another rock and broke a bone in his foot. In an hour we knew he couldn't walk, and it was going to be a long time before he was going to get a boot on that foot again. We were stuck right there until his foot mended, and boy, he didn't like the idea of that very much. When the rain stopped, we built a really good camp in a grove of trees back from the stream. We cut poles with the slasher head we'd found on a track over in the Watercress, and tied them between the trees with vines to make punga walls and bunks. We used punga fronds a foot thick over a sheet of black polythene for thatching, tied down with thin poles, and we built a big fireplace between Uncle Heck's big rock and the bank, a few feet from the doorway. We'd bound up his broken foot with shirt sleeves, and he could hobble around with a stick, tying knots. And giving bad-tempered orders, but that was about all. I was going to have to do all the hunting till his foot mended, however long that was going to take. We had to have meat, or our other food would be gone in a few days. I was going to be busy. We were out of meat by the time I went for my first hunt, and I had to get something. The dogs got interested in the wind from a narrow side creek about 20 minutes upstream from our camp, and when I investigated, I found a small mob of goats on a rocky slip down near the creek. There were 6 of them. I shot a young nanny goat through the neck, and the others all ran into the bush. The dogs scrambled up through the jumbled rocks and bailed up a billy goat on top of a boulder as big as a forestry hut. He was a white one with a long yellow beard and mane, and his horns curled out from his head in thick twists of bone, and he really stank. He fought the dogs off for about 10 minutes. No way were they getting up on his rock if he had any say in it. He shunted them off one after the other as they tried to claw their way up the slope of the boulder to get at him. And he was still looking for more, a brave goat, that one. I called the dogs off, and we left him there in charge of his boulder. I then carried the goat I'd shot back to camp. If it was as easy as this to get meat around here, but it wasn't. "Where'd you get this?" said Uncle Heck, flopping the dead goat from side to side. "Second creek on the right, up the left fork, Brave Goat Creek. Many there. 5 left out of the mob I saw, and another billy goat. There could be more there. I only got 2 minutes up the creek. Could come in handy." He never asked me how it got to be called Brave Goat Creek. We just called it Brave Goat Creek after that. Not bad meat goat, but I always preferred mutton or pork or venison. The next time I went out, I got right up into the head of a creek before the dogs got onto a mean little boar that was only just worth eating. It gave Willie a rip up the shoulder, and it took me 3.5 hours to get it back to the camp. Meantime, Uncle Heck hobbled around with his stick, throwing every bit of firewood he could reach into a huge heap beside the camp. His foot looked pretty painful to me, but he never said much about it. He hated having anything wrong with him, Uncle Heck. Next time I left him soaking his foot in the edge of the creek, and went downstream, where I walked all day without even seeing any fresh sign. The game that had been so plentiful when we had arrived had moved away. I got back to camp an hour or so after dark, wet and miserable with rain and failure. The dogs hadn't had a run all day, but Uncle Heck was looking smug about something, and I didn't find out what it was until he raked a big rainbow trout baked in clay out of the embers of the fire. He hobbled over to the big pool at the forks, about 150 meters, and caught it with a cricket on a hook and reel of nylon we had with our gear. It must have been tricky getting it landed without breaking the nylon, because you usually had to run up and down among the stones, following the trout till it tired and you could ease it into the shallows. It must have been quite a performance, the way Uncle Heck was fixed for running, but he never said anything about it. The trout was delicious, though stuffed with watercress and wine berry. In fact, I could have eaten the whole thing on my own if I'd had a chance. The next day I climbed up onto the ridge at the head of Broken Foot Creek. Nothing. It was getting dark, and I was half an hour from the camp, empty-handed and ready to give up, when the dogs found something under a branchy log, lying head down the creek bank. There was an animal under there, probably a possum, but it might be a duck or something. I climbed up, pulled a shattered branch away, and Willie dived in. Something black shot out behind me, and Zag grabbed it and shook it once before I got it off him. It was a big, dark brown kiwi with a broken neck. I'd never seen a kiwi close up before. This one was about the same size as an ordinary rooster, with thick brown legs, long thin beak, and ferrety little eyes. It had stumps of wings and hairish speckled feathers, and it felt as if I was holding something prehistoric in my hands. There seemed to be plenty of meat on it, so I carried it back to camp. By the time I got it there, my hands were cramped with the weight of it. "Never eaten one myself," said Uncle Heck. He flopped the dead kiwi around in the firelight. "You game to give it a go?" "It's the only meat we've got," I said. We took the ferny feathered skin off the dark red flesh and fried it in pieces in the camp oven we'd carried all the way from Tepua. Then we worked it up into a kind of casserole with some onion and other stuff we had, but no matter how long we cooked it, it was still like chewing musty, fishy rubber. "You can leave the next one of them where you find it," said Uncle Heck, throwing a piece back into the camp oven. I had to agree with him, and so did the dogs, but it filled a gap till I got a big pig not far from the camp next day. I managed to keep up with it for the next 3 weeks. One night it was a big eel I kicked up out of the shallows when I was almost back to camp with nothing. Another time the dogs grabbed a paradise duck in some long grass. Then we'd catch a pig and have a few days' rest from hunting. We got lucky too. One day I was having a rake with the dogs through a place I called White Sow Creek, where I'd picked up 1 or 2 feeds. Towards the head of the creek the dogs disappeared, so I carried up, listening for them. Suddenly a red-brown smudge ran through scattered trees and stopped on a little slip. Looking back at me, a deer about 40 meters ahead. I tried to get a bead on its neck, but couldn't hold the rifle steady. Shooting at real deer can make you nervous. The deer turned its head away to move again, so I took a wild aim and fired. I knew I'd hit it somewhere by the way it bucked a bit as it jumped out of sight, so I ran around to where it had been standing and started following its marks around the game trail looking for blood. Then Willie and Zag shot straight past me. There was a single bark in the creek bed 100 meters ahead, and when I got there the dogs were panting around at the foot of the bank beside my deer, dripping and wagging as though they'd done it all by themselves. I'd hit it through the chest, a lung shot. It was a 4-point stag, a big one. After I gutted it, I found I could just get it onto my back. I had about an hour to walk down White Sow Creek and then an hour and a half up to the camp, with the back legs over my shoulders, the blood dripping down my leg backs. The deer smell, the dogs, and the rifle slung across. I was right into the spirit of being a hunter that day, bringing home the meat. By the time I reached the main creek, I'd had to cut the head off because it kept tripping me up. The bones were digging into my shoulders and back, and the rifle was banging on my head or knee or elbow. I needed both hands to keep the deer balanced. I fell over a few times and had to have a number of rests, but I was determined to walk into camp with that deer on my back. I was so tired by the time I saw Uncle Heck's big fire shining in the trees up at the next bend that I had to lean my load on a log and have a little cry about Auntie Bella. After I had staggered into camp, Uncle Heck took over the deer and skinned it in the firelight, while I thankfully drank a full billy of tea. There was resting and feasting at Broken Foot for a good spell after that. After a few days, and while we still had a bit of meat in the camp, I walked over to the Te Pana hut to look for food. I got back to Broken Foot next night with a big load of flour and quite a bit of other stuff. Candles, 2 magazines, a sheet of plastic, some wire, and a tin for a new billy, for watercress because of some boils we were getting on us. It was a long walk, but it stopped Uncle Heck getting so worried every time I went somewhere on my own. He used to say it was because he didn't like not having the rifle around him in the bush. I was learning a few things from living in the bush. One of them was that there's a big difference between hunting for fun and having to do it to eat. Hunting had become like work that had to be done, sneaking through the bush, always looking for something to kill and eat, having to do it. Needing the meat. There was something savage about it, something kind of primitive. Do you think it's good for anyone to kill things all the time, Uncle Heck? What sort of things? Animals, pigs, deer, fish, stuff like that. Long as you don't start enjoying cutting throats, there's nothing to worry about. No fear of that with me. And there were always the nice things like birds. I always liked birds, and I'd got to know most of them in the Urwara, the shining cuckoo arriving each year from across the world to lead the dawn chorus in the Urwara. How about that? And the silly cheeky old weka spearing around in the undergrowth, the soft gray bush robin, and the pretty moppy little fantail. Then there was the beautifully dressed green and white bush pigeon, and the acrobatic kaka showing off in the high beeches, the fluffy moorpork owl, Ruru, hooting to his mates all night across the gully, and the dangerous diving sparrowhawk hurtling through the treetops, the green little bellbird with the melodious voice, and the blue-black tui in the yellow cowhide tree, the wind-up walk of the pukeko, the fearless blue mountain duck bobbing through the rapids, and the hovering harrier hawk, looking for a mouse or a frog or something dead. There was the bushman's friend, the Miro, I think he was, the shape and color of a kid's drawing, and the jagged shag, sitting on a stick in the river with a belly full of trout fingerlings, holding his wings out to dry so he can lift off, the white-faced heron, pale and delicate and shy, minding his own business out there along the edge of the river. There were more birds than that, but you mightn't like them as much as I do. In fact, I spent a lot of hours watching birds when I suppose I should have been hunting. One of my games was pretending to be a wildlife photographer, commissioned to get shots of birds in their natural habitat for a big nature magazine, National Geographic, perhaps. And if my chunk of wood had been a camera, I'd have taken some interesting photos. It was more like practice, really, in case I decided to take it up as a career or something. A funny thing happened about that. One day I was creeping after a kaka I'd seen from the camp, trying to get a shot of its orange underwings, using the rifle as a camera. Uncle Heck, dragging a big dead tawa branch, spotted me sneaking along. "What are you up to?" he said. "I was just trying to sneak up on that kaka." "What for? You don't want to eat them. There's not enough on one to fill the holes in your teeth. I was trying to see if I could get a photograph of it. If I had a camera," I confessed. He squatted down against a tree and started breaking up a stick of wood. "Is that what you want to get into?" he asked. "Wouldn't mind," I said. "What's wrong with that? I know a lot of birds. I watch them all the time. I bet I know more about them than you do." "Photographing 'em might turn out to be a bit trickier than just looking at 'em," he said. "I can learn photography," I told him. "I've read a bit about it, enough to know the kind of camera and lenses you need. They might even have better gear out by now, but I know I can suss it out pretty quick. All you'd have left to do after that is suss out how to get close enough to the birds." "I already know that," I said. "I spend hours just watching." Uncle Heck flicked the end of his stick at me, and it hit me in the chest. "I mean close," he said. "You don't understand the first thing about birds. You're going the wrong way about it from the start." "I suppose you know all there is to know about them," I said, getting ready to dodge a flattening. I reckoned I could outrun him these days, especially with him having a lame foot. "Birds are some of the hardest things to sneak up on you'll ever find," he went on, "even for another bird. And here you are creeping along, staring at them like a hungry cat." He shook his head at the sheer stupidity of it. "What am I supposed to do then?" "Well, look at it this way. A bird'll sit on a sheep's back. It'll feed round a horse's feet. It'll even sit in a crocodile's mouth and pick his teeth. But the same bird won't come within a stag's roar of a human being. What do you reckon causes that?" "Don't know," I said. "It's because human beings are so unpredictable," he said. "One of the sheep isn't going to leap up and chuck a stone all of a sudden. They're indifferent to the birds. That's your clue. Birds are territorial, mostly, and the best way to get near 'em is to move into their territory and ignore them. You can keep an eye on 'em without staring at 'em. You don't want to stay too still either. Things waiting in ambush do that. You just move quietly around, minding your own business like a sheep. Then it's a matter of your own patience." "Patience?" "Yeah, you might have to wait an hour or more for the bird life in a place to settle down. Once you disturb it, and not many people like to stick around that long, especially young blokes." He looked at me. It's not like waiting to me, I told him. He shrugged and stood up. I won't stop you, he said. Get into it if you want to. You're not going to be in here all your life. He grabbed the end of his tawa branch and started limping down the creek bed with it towards the camp. I picked up some lighting sticks and followed him. Where did you learn about birds, Uncle Heck? Mostly from an old Aboriginal lady I was bushed with once up in Arnhem Land. An old lady? What were you doing there? Hunting. Hunting what? Snakes, grubs, lizards, birds, anything we could get to eat. The Mornington Islanders had stolen our canoe and all our gear, and a load of salted dugong meat. We were cut off by the wet season, and all we had was a knife and a burning gum branch. How long did you do that for? About 8 weeks. We crossed the Roper River on a log and made it out to the Gulf in the finish and got to a place called Borolula on the MacArthur River. I got through to Darwin after that and waded out wet. What happened to the old lady? She went back to her tribe on the Lemon River, but I reckon I'd have been dingo meat if it hadn't been for her. I've been in the bush with a few people, but that old Abo lady could run rings around anyone else I've ever seen. How? She just moved so good through the bush she never hassled an ant. She could tell you by the state of the insects what birds were likely to be around, and she could tell by the birds what animals were in the area. She could tell by the mud crabs just where to wait for a barramundi with a burnt, sharpened stick. The birds used to carry on as though she wasn't there, and when I'd sneak up behind her, they'd start squeaking and flying around as though someone had fired a couple of shots. When we were looking for Tucker, I had to stay so far behind her I could hardly keep her in sight. I was so clumsy compared with her. I'm not bad in the scrub myself, but the only use I was to her was carrying the fire stick and helping her roll logs over to get at the grubs. We walked on for a bit, and then he said, I'd have died on my own. There's no one can sneak like an Abo. Must have been pretty tough going, I said. We'd come out on the flat near the camp by this time, and he stopped and looked round at me. It was no tougher than this. Uncle Heck had said one of those things I couldn't forget. There's no one can sneak like an Abo. And every time it came into my mind I couldn't help imagining this old black lady taking Uncle Heck out into the desert, years ago in another land, and giving him a message about birds to pass on years later to young black Ricky Baker in the Urawara bush. I felt kind of grateful to her from a long way off. Maybe she was an ancestor of mine or something, or maybe I needed something to fill the gaps of not having much to do with other people. Whatever it was, that old lady, the bird lady, was with me in the bush whenever I thought about her after that. I even sneaked different, as though she was watching to see if I did it right. She taught me to like the vines and roots and bluffs and boulders that got in my way, and suddenly they'd be behind me and nice to have known you. You walk lighter on the land when you like the land you walk on, and you can see your way through a tangle of vines or a heap of rocks or a tricky river before you even reach them. Distance becomes a different thing too, and time, it alters your pace to do it right. You move slower, but you get there sooner, and quieter, and more convinced than last time that, in a mysterious kind of way, it's all one big living thing. I had a whole new relationship with the birds to explore too, and I could get into their scenes real easy once I got used to it. Uncle Heck was right. There's no one can sneak like an Abo. The night after I got back from Tepana hut with the load of flour and stuff we had the first heavy frost of the winter. Keeping warm became very important, so we improved our little ware to make it more rain and wind-proof, made a goatskin door laced onto a framework of wineberry sticks built up round our fireplace with flat rocks, doubled the depth of crown fern on our bunks, and tied extra poles along the roof to hold down the polythene and thatching. It ended up real cozy, especially when the light and heat from the fire reflected right into the hut at night. The dogs were snug too. Zag had a bunk under the roots of an upturned rimu, and Willie had a speargrass nest under the bank near the fireplace. They were doing fine on the biggest, blackest possums Uncle Heck had seen for years. There's an unusually good colony of possums around here, he said half a dozen times. One real cold morning, it was just getting daylight, and I was lighting the fire when I heard something that sent me ducking in to wake Uncle Heck up. "Wake up," I said, giving him a shake. "What's up?" he said, sitting up in his sleeping bag. "The stags are roaring," I said. "Listen." We went outside. A distant moan came wafting down from high on the range at the head of the valley, to be followed by a loud bellowing from up behind the camp. There was another roar from further away, and then silence except for the birds. "They are roaring all right," he said. "We'll have to be extra careful for the next few weeks. The Urwara will be crawling with trophy hunters. They go everywhere. The choppers will be busy too. You'd better take the slasher and see how many trees you can drop across that old helicopter pad you found the other day." So we lit no fires in the daytime and listened and watched for signs of other people. It was an extra worry when I was away scrounging for food, and every time I got back to camp it was a relief to find out that Uncle Heck hadn't had a visit from anyone while I was away. We were very vulnerable just then with Uncle Heck's foot, and I could tell he was worried about it by his bad temper. I heard 2 shots one day from way over on the next watershed, and I found gumboot marks crossing our creek 2 hours downstream from the camp, but nothing worth mentioning to Heck. The stags roared around there for 4 weeks, morning and evening mostly. The big old one high up in the beach country would moan 2 or 3 times. Then the noisy one on Pigeon Ridge would bellow like a calf, and when he'd had his say, the one we called Hookgrass Harry would bellow and bark and grunt in several bursts. He was on a swampy bend in the heads of the little creek opposite the camp, about a quarter a mile away. Those were the regulars, but Uncle Heck said he'd identified 26 different stags he'd heard from the camp during the roar. I wondered where they all disappeared to when I was out hunting. One afternoon, at the height of the roar, I tied up the dogs and climbed up to see how close to Hookgrass Harry I could sneak. For a start, I just headed up in his general direction, and I'd climbed right past him when he let out a roar about 50 yards away. I went prickly with fright. Even the bird lady froze. No idea it was going to be that loud. I stood there with a bit more than half my attention on a tree I could get up quick, and then he roared again, a rattling, rasping bellow that could only come out of something real dangerous and big. I knew not to be scared, but I still was. I sneaked slowly round to where the noise was coming from. The wind was gusty and blowing everywhere at once, so with a bit of luck it might scent me and run away. It roared again, and I skipped a bit closer. The bird lady seemed to have stayed back by the leaning tree. Again it roared, and I made about 20 yards toward it. I heard something crashing like gorillas. I moved up behind another tree in a gust of wind, and then I saw him. He was an 8-pointer stag, walking up and down a 10-yard flat pace, stopping every now and then to roar again, or rip his antlers through a tincaha bush that was hanging in shreds of stripped bark and broken branches. It was the biggest deer I'd seen, and I could see why Uncle Heck had said, "Don't try it with the 22, you'll only tickle him." He had a dark, shaggy mane of hair round his neck and a big yellow ring round his rump. The rest of him was thick grayish hair apart from his belly, which was black like his legs. His antlers were brown from tincaha bark and shining white at the tips. He roared again and gave 4 or 5 huge grunts. I don't know how long I stood there looking at him, perhaps 10 minutes, when I turned back from listening to another stag roar further round the face and found the hookgrass Harry was looking straight at me. He'd seen my head move. It was a nasty moment that. I'd never been looked at so hard by anything in my life, except maybe Uncle Heck, when he was getting ready to flatten me. But this was different. A wild animal that roared like a dragon and ripped things to bits with its antlers. I got ready to fire a shot to try and frighten it away, but the stag moved first. He gave a grunt and leapt away, down and across through the bush, and he was gone. I stood there wondering about it. What would a 12-pointer be like to come across in the roar? Pretty impressive, I imagined. But when I did see one later on the Pohukura Ridge, my imaginings were nothing like it. He's a mighty animal, the red stag. You had to have respect for him. Anyway, the wind had been getting more gusty for an hour or so, and as I made my way back down through the bush, it started getting very strong. By the time I got to camp, Uncle Heck was hopping around, tying down the roof, and the trees were thrashing about in the sudden gusts, as though they were throwing fits. I thought it was going to be a bit of fun at first, but this wasn't any ordinary wind. It was the Urwara wind, a roaring, shunting gale, developed broken up by the bush and ridges into aimless, buffeting blasts that hit you from any old direction. I realized it was getting serious when the whole fire suddenly blew out of the fireplace with a swirl of ashes and embers and burning bits of wood, streaming sparks and smoke out across the flat. While we stood a few yards away and watched it with no more than a bit of disturbed air blowing around us at the time, we staggered round with logs from the creek bed to lay on our roof, which was going to lift off and blow away at any moment, groping our way through the wind and stopping and hanging on in the gusts. Every now and then we'd be caught in a driven rain of spray whipped up off the surface of the creek. The whole bush face opposite the camp was writhing. When we'd done everything we could to hold the roof on and put rocks on everything that hadn't already blown away, we went inside and sat on our bunks, listening to the power and destruction of it. A big tree came crashing down in the bush across from the camp, one of the dead ratas. That rising roar of the storm tore at the bush until all we could do was to sit in our flimsy lifting wear and grin when we survived another big one. The wind left our ragged-out valley just before dark that night, to be followed by a thick layer of blue cloud and heavy rain before we could even get the fire going. Urwara rain, it doesn't fall in drops like ordinary rain. It starts like a bucket full of marbles being tipped out on the roof, and then it's a continuous stream of white lines hissing and splashing into the bush, beating everything flat and keeping it there, bouncing spray off every surface. By dark our creek was up a foot, and by morning it was still raining. It was more than 2 meters above normal. We could hear the rocks and logs booming and rumbling down through the heaving brown torrent that had once been our little creek. The rain had its own cold little wind with it, which swept the spattering rain through the gaps round the door of our ware, so the only dryish place was in our sleeping bags on our bunks. We just stayed in bed until the rain eased off into ordinary showers. A couple of hours after daylight, then we started a tiny fire with a candle stub, and built it up into a real big one with the aid of man-sized logs brought out of the bush by Uncle Heck on his one leg. Soon everything was steaming and drying out, and looking much better, with mugs of tea made with dirty water and fresh damper, and the last of the pork and a billy of watercress. What good stuff fire is! We kept the fire going all night because it was freezing. Next day we had a frost followed by an overcast sky. The creek was so flooded that you couldn't go anywhere except straight up behind the camp, and it was never any good up there. All we could do was keep the fire going and try to eat as little as possible. The next day was fine but freezing. The creek had gone nearly back to normal, leaving everything changed and swept clean, with logs and driftwood piled up in different places, and the creek bed itself on a new course across the shingle flats. I made a quick trip over to the Tataweka hut to try for supplies, and I found that the chopper I'd heard just before I got there had dropped off a fantastic load of stuff, probably for a team of track cutters. The first thing I did was punch holes in a tin of condensed milk and drink the lot. Then I loaded Uncle Heck's pack with milk, sugar, flour, butter, 2 loaves of fresh bread, a cabbage, 2 books, and a stretch bandage out of the first aid box. It was a big load, and there was still plenty left. Those forestry blokes certainly looked after themselves. I stashed a few tins of peas and cheese and milk under a tawa down the flat from the hut, and then had another poke through to see if there was anything I ought to add to my load. But the sound of a chopper sent me off down the track in a hurry. Just as well, too, because that load almost did for me, getting it back to Broken Foot. Uncle Heck was pleased to see me and my big load of goodies. "You needn't have brought all that," he said, "but let's get one of those cans of tomato soup open." The food from the hut kept us going through a lean time of hunting. We'd been in the area for too long to hope for any easy meat. I shot 3 more goats out of Brave Goat Creek, and a few more pigs by hunting further away all the time, but it was getting harder. We were nearly down to eating possum several times. I got lost one day and nearly spent the night in the bush. I had no idea where I was, but just on dark I dropped down off a ridge and came out on the creek bed just where I'd lit a fire a few days earlier to have a brew. I reached camp an hour after dark, but I didn't say anything to Uncle Heck about getting bushed. I was supposed to be able to remember exactly where I was at all times. Uncle Heck's foot was improving, especially after we changed the shirt sleeves for a proper bandage. He could take a bit of weight on it and get around more easily, but he still couldn't get his boot on. It made him real crotchety, that foot. I was reading Don Quixote again, and he used to say it was turning my head, but he was only looking for something to grumble about. It's a good book, that. The winter was half over by the time he could walk on his foot again. We were down to fried eel and damper by this time, and the dogs were definitely eating better than we were. We'd been at Broken Foot Camp for just under 8 weeks, and we would have to move on soon to stay eating. As a matter of fact, I suspected I was losing weight from not enough to eat. My pants were getting loose. We made it to the Te Pua hut the first day and had to do a starve for another few days because we'd overdone it. on Uncle Heck's foot. When we got to the Tawarana hut, we finally found some food: flour, rice, powdered milk, instant mashed potatoes, and half a tin of golden syrup. There was a notice on the wall. I read it out: to Hector William Faulkner of Apopo Village Road, Gisborne County. You are required to present yourself and Richard Morhew Baker at the nearest police station immediately. If you have failed to comply with this order within 14 days of June 30th, you will be deemed to be a fugitive from the law, and a warrant will be issued for your immediate arrest. N. Craddock, Clerk of the Court, Gisborne County. Note: any person or persons offering assistance to the above named in any way renders themselves liable to a fine not exceeding $1,000 or a maximum of 6 months' imprisonment. Here it was again: other people interfering with us. Uncle Heck tore the poster off the wall and used it to light the fire. "They're getting serious," he said. "We'll have to be more careful from now on." I liked the way Uncle Heck never thought of giving in, and judging by the number of notices we found, they must have stuck one of them in just about every hut in the Urwara. There was no going back now. We were fugitives from the law. Our freedom was threatened. Chapter 6. A Friend. As we made our way through the bush, we developed a new set of rules. We had to assume that every ranger, forestry worker, hunter, tramper, and chopper pilot would know about us and be on the watch for us. The track-cutting gangs didn't worry us. The only thing that makes more noise than a track cutter in the bush is a helicopter, said Uncle Heck. We weren't so concerned about the possum trappers either. Anyone who'd leave a camp full of skins and walk out to report us to the cops wouldn't be very bright, Uncle Heck pointed out. Possum trappers don't dob people in as a rule anyway. They've usually got more to worry about. Whenever we traveled on a main track, we made it a rule that one of us went 50 or 60 meters ahead. It cut down on any talking, and it gave us a chance for the one behind to get out of sight if we ran into anyone. We agreed to brush our teeth and have a proper wash at least every 2 days, in case we slipped into getting dirty without noticing. Uncle Heck kept his beard down to bristles with a little pair of scissors we'd found in one of the huts. Before that, we'd been giving each other haircuts by setting fire to each other's hair with a candle and brushing it out before it went too far, with not very good results. We were getting better at knowing where to find supplies of food. Some of the huts were always being replenished by trampers and hunters who spent their last night in the bush there, and there were huts that never seemed to have anything in them at all. It always worked out that the more food, the more people, and the risk of being spotted by someone, and we'd have to move away to some other part of the Urwara. But we were certainly eating better now. We could move around. When it rained, we usually sneaked up and checked out one of the huts, and if there was no one around, we'd move in and make ourselves comfortable. It was fairly safe to stay in a hut while the rivers were flooded because no one could get through the tracks. The choppers hardly ever stopped at the huts. They cost too much to run for any flight time that wasn't hunting. They had to catch an animal an hour just to cover their costs, and we'd heard that most of them were having a struggle to stay in business. The price of live deer was about half what it was the year before, and lifting out venison didn't cover the cost of running the machine. We never had much to do with the Chopper people. They lived in a different world from us. On fine days, we often camped on a bush terrace up a side creek somewhere and slept or read books until it was dark and safe to light a fire. At night, it was a different matter. We had the whole Urwera to ourselves and could wander round in the open and build up huge fires if we felt like it. We even talked louder at night to make up for the whispers of the daytime. We were becoming nocturnal. Another thing we discovered was that the paradise duck, the Putangitangi, had changed from being a noisy nuisance to a perfect alarm system. No one can sneak up on a paradise duck, apart perhaps from an abo, and we found that if we camped on their territory, they'd fly up and down, kicking up a mighty racket for about half an hour. Then they'd settle down again, but remain super alert. Whenever anyone else appeared from any direction, the ducks would warn us in time for us to grab our gear and disappear into the bush before they could get within sight. We had only one genuine alarm from the Putangitangi and some false ones, but you could relax a few notches when you knew they were watching out for you. Towards the end of the winter, the pigs, our main meat, became skinnier and more scarce until we couldn't find any anywhere. Even Uncle Heck had given up guessing where they might be. In the finish, we had to go right out to the edge of the bush and compete with the weekend hunters to get a decent bit of pork. Then the rain made us go back to one of the huts. We did have one memorable feed about that time. We were skimming through some of the best huts, but there weren't many people in the bush at that time of year. The last thing we'd eaten was half a weka each and a packet of instant noodles we'd found in the Onapu hut, and that was hours before. We crossed the Kahikatea range and dropped down a steep shingly Tawa Creek head of the Atapukawa stream, and suddenly we saw dozens of wood pigeons eating the miro berries we were going to eat. We chose a good spot in a grove of miro trees and waited for the pigeons to come flapping in, whistling with weight to land on the branches. Then we plonked them with the .22. They were so fat that some of them burst, an inch of bright yellow fat all over them. When they hit the ground, when we had 8 of them, we set up our camp by a trickle of water and smothered the birds in clay, feathers and guts and all, until they looked in the firelight like a row of loaves of bread. Then we rolled them into the embers of the fire and built it up around them. We waited for just over an hour before raking them out and breaking them open like Easter eggs. The feathers came away with the clay, as did most of the skin. They were falling apart and very delicious and tasty. Uncle Heck ate 2 of them on his own, while the bird lady and I ate 1½ each. The rest of them we wrapped in leaves and took with us when we moved on to Manuaha the next day. Next we visited a few more huts before sheltering from the rain in the Huatapu for 2 days. When the weather cleared, we headed towards the northern end of the Urwera to meet the spring, and on the way there we had our worst argument ever. We'd been walking for hours with heavy packs, and we'd come down the wrong side of the Mangataniwa range and found ourselves in a steep, waterfally, log-jammed, bush-lowery, slippery little creek. I told you we should have gone further along the main range, I told Uncle Heck. He looked back at me up some rocks. He had just slid down beside a waterfall and said, "If you tell me that once more, I'll flatten you, you smart little bastard." "You're wrong, and you won't admit it," I said. "You snore too." "I hit pretty hard as well," he said, looking dangerous. "You'd better not hit me," I told him. He jumped forward, grabbing at my leg, and I got out of the way just in time. If he'd got a hold of me then, he'd have flattened me all right. I ran back up the creek a few yards for a head start, but he didn't come after me. We stood looking over this waterfall at each other for a while, and then he turned and walked off down the creek. "Come on, then," I think he said, and that was the last thing either of us said to each other for 2 days and nights, which was a bit hard case considering what happened to us just after that. When we finally crawled out of the mouth of that creek and set off up the river towards Central Waiau Hut, we suddenly heard a strange noise. So we stopped. The trees were shivering. The ground was shaking and trembling under our feet. The movement got heavier, and suddenly we were in the middle of a great big earthquake. Dislodged rocks started crashing off a bluff above us, hurtling down through the bush, and bounding out into the air, breaking up and landing all around us. All we could do was watch them coming and try to dodge the rocks of all sizes and shapes, pelting like rain at us. On the other side, something big crashed into the river, but we were too busy to dare look round, even when rotten, broken lumps of wood flew out past me onto the stones. Then we were up to our ankles in water. The riverbed had lifted and pushed the water out across the shingle flat before draining away again. Then the earthquake stopped, just like that. There was no time even to get scared. One moment we were being belted with rocks pelting all round us, and the river was going mad. The next, everything was back to normal again, except the stones were wet. A big dead matai tree had fallen across the river, and its shattered branches were lying scattered around, and there was broken rock everywhere. Otherwise, it was hard to believe what we'd just seen happening. I looked at Uncle Heck to see what he was going to say about it, but he didn't say anything at all until 2 nights later when we were over in the Wakatane Valley. It had rained half the night and most of the day, and we'd dropped down to the river in another of Uncle Heck's bad places and found it flooded from bank to bank. We had to cross it if we didn't want to spend the night in the rain. There was a big forestry hut half an hour downstream on the other side, and we had some rice and powdered milk stashed in a plastic bag near there. We would normally have stopped and talked about it, but this time Uncle Heck didn't even pause. He walked straight out into the current and let it carry him waist deep across to the sweep of the bend on the far side. By this time I'd felt my way out into the current as well, and suddenly the force grabbed my legs and I had to go with it, running in slow motion under the browned water, bobbing downstream in the surge of it, easing my way across the stones toward the far side, already well downstream of Uncle Heck. Suddenly I was in serious trouble. A broken off branch started to sweep and roll along with me, carrying me right down the rapids under the water, rolling round and round, and then out into a big swirl, with my pack the only thing that floated me upright, and then down into another straight. Just when I thought I was going to fall through the next rapids, my foot got a shove on a rock, and I clawed and crawled and splashed my way out into shallow water where I lay coughing and gasping, and realizing how easy it'd be to get drowned. Uncle Heck came hurrying over and dragged me onto my feet. I coughed up some water I'd swallowed. "Next time you can do that on your own," I said between coughs. "Next time we'll wait for the river to go down a bit, eh?" he said. And we were talking again. Springtime came and then disappeared for a week before returning. We'd made it through the winter. All of a sudden there were deer and pigs in every creek and river bed. The huts were stocked with new food, and a new clutch of helicopters slapped their way across the ridges. Every night and morning, the Urwara was coming alive again, and the dawn chorus of the birds became noisier every day. There were people everywhere, but with plenty to eat, we had the leisure to be able to keep out of their way. It was a quiet life after the hassles of the winter, and in spite of having to be extra careful, we soon had stocks of food stashed near several of the huts in case of emergencies. We also knew the location of the keys to 4 of the forestry food cupboards, which had just been stocked up for the summer season. We had plenty of food for the time being, but I wasn't going to forget the lessons of Broken Foot Camp for a while. We'd been sleeping by a creek on a grassy bank one day until the sandflies drove us awake, when we sidled out and waited on the bluff opposite the Coronga Forks hut until the sun went down. There was no sign of life, so we came down from the bluff in the last of the twilight. It was dark by the time we rounded the track to the hut, certain that we had the place to ourselves for the night, but Uncle Heck suddenly stopped and held up his hand to be quiet. "What's up?" I whispered. "Someone's been here recently," he said. "Like today, I can smell the fire. Hasn't been out long enough." We threw a piece of wood on the roof to see if anyone was sleeping in there. No response. "I'll go in and have a look," said Uncle Heck. He entered the hut, and I saw a match flare up and the candle flame inside. "Come here," he called out. I went into the hut and saw a man lying on one of the bunks. I thought he must have been dead at first, but his arm, hanging over the side of the bunk, twitched in the candlelight. "What's wrong with him?" I said, peering. "Dunno. Hold this candle." Uncle Heck bent over the man and gave him a shake. "Hey, mate, wake up." He was a big young man, bleary and pale and unshaven. He stank a bit. His eyes opened into wet slits, and he looked towards us, trying to say something, but no sound came out. "This bloke's crook," said Uncle Heck. "Get some wood and water in here, and I'll get a fire going." We found another candle, and when I came back from the creek with a billy of water, Uncle Heck poured some into a mug and tried to get the sick man to drink, but he started coughing and choking, and I thought he was going to die right then. Then he lay back, gasping, and seemed to go to sleep again. "Let's have a brew anyway," said Uncle Heck. "What's wrong with him?" I whispered. "No idea, but he's not going to last much longer by the look of him. What'll we do?" "One of us will have to go out and get a chopper in for him. There's a sheep station about an hour and a half up the Coronga from here. Good track all the way. Someone'll have to go out and get them to ring up for a chopper at daylight. Don't know if this rooster's going to last till then, but it's the best we can do." "We'll both go," I suggested. "No," he said. "One of us ought to stay here and make sure he doesn't choke on something." "I'll go then," I said, not really liking the idea of being left alone in the hut with the dying man and half a candle. "Okay," said Uncle Heck. "We'll get a feed into you, and I'll show you where the track starts. You have to be sure to remember where it comes out of the bush at the other end. Could be tricky to find in the dark." "I'll remember," I promised. He cut across with my knife in the side of a milk powder tin and poked a candle into it. It made a nifty torch, which lit up the track in front of me brightly. I grabbed another third of a candle and some matches, and I was ready. Yell out from above the house and wake them up. Get them to ring the police in Matawai and tell them there's a bloke dying in the Forks hut. Needs urgent medical attention. All right, I said, I've got it. I powered up the track and came out on farmland almost before I was ready for it. I located the farmhouse by a light in one of the windows. Dogs started barking as I approached, and I shouted, "Hey, anyone home?" Another light came on before the door opened, and a man came out into the light. I could see him, but he couldn't see me and the bird lady in some fern up the hill. "What's going on?" he called out, shielding his eyes and looking around. "There's a man dying in the Forks hut," I called back. "Can you ring the police and get them to send a helicopter for him in the morning?" "I suppose so. How long has he been sick? What's the matter with him?" "We don't know. Just arrived there and found him. We don't know if he'll live till morning." "Okay, I'll give him a ring. Would you like a cup of tea and something to eat?" It was a thrilling idea, but no thanks. I'll have to get back. You'll ring up then. "Sure, you can come in and ring them yourself if you like. We won't eat you." "No thanks," I called back, and dropped over onto the road to go back to the track because I could tell that no one was going to chase after me. All the same, the bird lady had me ready to leap up the bank into the bush at the first sound of a motor starting up behind me. It wasn't so good going back to the hut. I was worn out and down to my last stub of spare candle when I stumbled across the swing bridge and into the hut. Uncle Heck revived me with tea and scone loaf and a tin of lamb's tongues. The man was still alive. He'd been awake for a few minutes and had drunk some tea. Uncle Heck had been able to make out that he was diabetic, but he hadn't been able to say any more than that. I'd never read anything about diabetics, and Uncle Heck didn't know about them either. "I think it's got something to do with sugar," he said. "Anyway, it looks like he might just hang on till morning. You're sure they're going to ring up?" I nodded. "Far as I could tell. We'd better be ready for them then. They might just try to grab us along with our patient here." We stashed our packs in the bush behind the hut before I slept. When Uncle Heck woke me with a feed before daylight, the sick man hadn't stirred, but he was still breathing. I stood outside with my mug of tea, listening. Then I caught a faint vibration in the air down the valley. "Chopper," I yelled. "Right," said Uncle Heck. "Let's go." He took a quick look at the man on the bunk, and we grabbed our packs and climbed up onto the ridge in the bush, keeping the dogs close in behind. We'd just settled down when a Hughes 500 dived in and landed by the hut. Two men in overalls jumped out and ran, ducking under the blades to the hut. Then they came back to fetch a stretcher from the chopper and brought the sick man out on it and loaded him into the machine. Soon they lifted off and climbed away down the valley. "Hope he makes it," said Uncle Heck. "What now?" I asked. "Well, they know we are around here somewhere. If they are going to try and round us up, this'd be a good time for them to try." He thought for a while. "I reckoned if we climbed back onto that bluff where we were yesterday, we could keep an eye on the place and see what happens." "Won't that be dangerous?" "No more than anything else we do. They'd be expecting us to be an hour away from here by this time, but I wouldn't put it past them to try and catch us. Let's move." We cut round to the Kahanui branch and left a few footprints leading upstream before coming back down, walking in the water and climbing up onto the bluff opposite the hut. No sooner had we tied the dogs up in some fern when the same chopper dropped back in and let 4 men off, 3 of them with rifles. Then the chopper took off again up the Kahanui. and 2 of the men went up the koronga and the others up the ridge behind the hut. By the time they were out of sight, Uncle Heck was curled up in his sleeping bag among some tree roots. He hadn't slept all the previous night. I had some cheese and bread before climbing into my sleeping bag and falling asleep too. The sound of the chopper returning woke us up. It was late afternoon, and the last of the sun was just leaving our level. Down in the shadow we saw the 4 men get into the chopper before it lifted off. It flew right past where we were crouched in the fern, and as soon as it had gone, we gathered our gear together, untied the dogs, and went back to the hut for a feed of rice risotto, beef noodles, buttered damper, and condensed milk in our tea. We both felt indignant about them searching for us like that, so we hung around the Fork's hut till we'd eaten nearly all the food there. Then we took it easy up the Kanui River to Tawa Hut, where there was someone installed, so we watched from a low ridge downstream. A short, dark man came out of the hut and started chopping wood. Uncle Heck knew him. He was an old trapping mate of his called Brian. Quiet Brian, because he never talked much. There was no one else about, so we went down and said good day, and had a big feed of his meat and spuds. Quiet Brian had been trapping around Tawa all winter, and he had a good line of skins. He'd done well, and was going to pay off his house in Gisborne this trip. He had plenty of supplies, and no one else had been there for weeks, so we camped with him for a few days, and gave him a hand tacking out skins and shifting a line of traps. He'd been warned by the rangers to keep a lookout for us. The first night we were there, Quiet Brian cooked up some juicy venison steaks in his cast iron camp oven, very nice. I ate a whole back steak of my own, about 15 pieces. Next day he was showing us his possum skin setup in a separate shed when Uncle Heck noticed the big bulge in the muslin cloth hanging dripping into a dirty yogurt bottle. "What's this?" he said. "Possum fat," said Quiet Brian. I put all the scrapings of my skins through it, strains it. "What for?" I asked uneasily. "I do all my cooking in it," he said. I suddenly recognized the unfamiliar taste I'd noticed about the venison the night before. Quiet Brian's maggoty possum skins. I was just about sick, and I never ate anything out of his oven after that. Instead, I found an old aluminum frying pan and cleaned it up to cook my stuff in. Quiet Brian was genuinely sorry for me not being able to digest possum fat like that. Uncle Heck didn't like it either. He went out in the rain one day and came back with a whole mutton. Plenty of proper dripping to cook in, but you could still tell that Quiet Brian actually preferred possum fat. It would have been nice to stay on at Tawa for a while. It was so peaceful, and I started feeling ordinary again. But after 8 days, Uncle Heck became uneasy about the possibility of other people being around, and we decided to move on. Quiet Brian and Uncle Heck swapped boots and arranged for Quiet Brian to leave a pack horse of supplies under a certain bank for us. He wouldn't let us pay him anything for them and seemed really sad when we parted. The dogs were sad too. They were so full of possum they could hardly walk. I liked Quiet Brian. He was our friend, maybe our only friend in all that bush. I didn't realize why Uncle Heck was so keen to get away from him until we ran into a bunch of people less than an hour away from Tawa, heading in that direction. If they'd found us camped there, Quiet Brian would have been liable to a maximum fine of $1,000 or a term of imprisonment not exceeding 6 months. There were 4 people in the party, and they sprang us out on the open riverbed. They were trampers, 2 girls, a boy, and an older man. Uncle Heck employed his usual evasive tactics and kept walking straight towards them without altering stride. I followed him, and as we walked past them, one of the girls said, "Oh, it's them." The ones the police are looking for," said the older man. And we just kept walking until we were clear of them. We'd now been seen twice in the same valley in 2 weeks. So we struck out for the far side of the Urwara, and 6 days later we rested up in a wreck of a hut in the Moko Nui. At night we could hear the trucks grinding over the Tapo Napier highway, but we were as safe here as anywhere else we could think of, except perhaps at Broken Foot Camp. There were some fat wild sheep in the Moko Nui, so we stayed there for 10 days and took a big supply of roasted mutton with us when we moved on. It was good to know we didn't have to catch a pig or go hungry. We had so much meat we didn't know what to do with it. Uncle Heck had talked about a hot pool beside a creek on an old deer block of his, and on a scrounging trip through the Hatapu, I talked him into making a detour. It was a 2-day walk, and he wasn't sure if it was still there or not, but we eventually found it. You could smell the sulfur everywhere, but it took us a while to find the actual hot water. A red seepage steaming at the bottom of a bank a few feet from the creek. It took us a good hour to clear enough stones out of the hole for us to bathe, and we found that it filled up with seepage from the creek almost as fast as we could dig it. We were wet and white-fingered by the time we'd hollowed out the bath, and all we had for our trouble was a patch of smelly tepid water at one edge of a big hole full of pure cold bush creek. We'd had it for the day. We found a site just downstream where there was plenty of firewood and risked a big warm-up. Next morning, light rain and sleet was falling, and it was very wet and gloomy. I wandered up to have a look at the big hole we dug the day before, and the whole surface was steaming. It had hotted up during the night. I swirled my hand through it and started yelling out for Uncle Heck. We could just stand the heat in the cooler water near the creek, but the electric flakes of sleet drove us deeper like nails into the hot water, right up to our ears. It took half an hour to ease our way over to the hot edge near the bank before we staggered out, steaming like ghosts in the rain, until the cold started stinging through and we slipped back into the hot water again. When we'd had too much of the experience, we fumbled weakly around, pulling our clothes on and building up a big fire to dry everything out. I had one more soak in the hot pool later that day when the rain stopped, but Uncle Heck said he was already soggy enough and gave it a miss. 3 days later at Pohukura, we still stank of sulfur, but it was worth it to have had that mighty bath. From Pohukura, we moved across into the Waiau Valley, and it was there in the Te Watupapiti hut that they finally caught us.